This story is intertwined with a place bathed in moonlight filtering through bars, in a gloomy cell where the stale air mixed with a penetrating subterranean cold. In that place, a terrifying man was biting his victim's neck, sinking his sharp teeth into the skin. The young woman in his hands tried to resist, but he kept biting the hands she used to defend herself in this uncomfortable situation. Was the result of the events on the first day of young Lenatis' 20th birthday. A little before this event, she was walking in the garden and heard Emjuel calling her. He ran towards her, panting, and he immediately informed her that he had been looking for her for a long time. The young woman was surprised that he was looking for her and not Estella, but Emjuel stated that there was no reason he should only look for her. Then, he held out a ribbon that he wanted to give her for her birthday, which was the next day. Emjuel also bought a similar ribbon for Estella, but in reality the gift was just a cover. This shy boy is a farmer's son, a very kind and charming young man, and it infuriated Lenatis that he was trying to flirt with her sister, whom she loved deeply and had no intention of giving up. The boy didn't understand her reaction. She wasn't just an object, but a person. Emjuel noticed a sack in Lenatis' hands, and she explained that she was taking it to her Aunt Lancet at that moment. He kindly offered to carry it himself, so she could go enjoy lunch with Estella. He didn't have to insist much. Lenatis tossed him the sack, which turned out to be heavy, and almost knocked him over. The girl just asked him to deliver it safe and sound, after which she said goodbye. As she did, she flirted a little with him and gave him her wonderful smile. Lenatis was a normal girl, just very strong, and she lived in a quiet little village. Her mother died when she was very young, and she was raised by a grumpy father. But she had a good life. Very kind-hearted people lived in her village, although they weren't very rich. But everyone had enough food to live well. Besides, Lenatis had the most beautiful and kind-hearted older sister whose name was Estella. She was always digging in the dirt, but she loved it very much. Even now, as Lenatis approached her, Estella practically replaced her younger sister's mother and raised her, giving her the best upbringing. As a child, she started working in the fields and also gathered food in the mountains and the forest. Lenatis was always grateful to her sister for raising her, and now she brought her an apple offering to eat it together after lunch. Estella was the most precious person to her sister. That's why she didn't want to hand her over to Emjuel. Tomorrow, Lenatis would be an adult and could do various jobs and help her sister support the family. She had only a couple of minutes left until she turned 20 before the chimes struck exactly midnight. And as soon as the tolling of the hours was heard, the young woman suddenly felt very strange. Again, the scene in that gloomy cell, the heroine suffering abuse, returned to her mind. She had already been through this countless times. She knew the next step perfectly. A man of unsettling beauty was captivated by her. He saw her as a sorceress who drove him mad, and that girl was Estella. And right at the climax, Lenatis heard her sister calling her full of anguish. Even Estella felt that something was wrong with her, and worry completely overcame her. Her little sister confessed to having a headache, but the truth was that she had remembered something. The truth is that she is in the world of a novel she read in her previous life. The beginning of this wild novel was the madness of the protagonist, Archduke Theodore. He is the heir of the Karios, where madness afflicts all adults, sometimes even children. Over time, the madness would subside, but before that, it ravaged everything. Many would die or be killed. The only way to calm this was by consuming the blood or saliva of the sorceress. Lenatis couldn't understand how she had become fond of such reading in her past life. Besides, it infuriated her to learn everything all at once on her 20th birthday. Someone could have taught her gradually. In the vegetable garden, she saw radishes intertwined as if hugging, and for some reason that exasperated Lenatis. Seeing how she stomped on that strange plant, Estella and Emjuel grew worried about her, but she just continued to furiously pound the ground, angry that the entire novel had been shoved into her head in a single morning. Immediately, Estella came closer and, worried for her well-being, touched her forehead to check her temperature. Everything was fine with that, but she still advised Lenatis to put everything aside today and just rest. In reality, Lenatis felt terrible realizing that her older sister would become the heroine of that absurd novel. She would give her blood day and night to the protagonist, and would be a victim of his madness, and in the end, in a cold basement and with weakened eyesight, she decides to leave this world. And that will be the end of the story, the end of the suffering-filled life of Estella Crastier. And Lenatis decided to prevent this tragedy. Turning to her sister, she declared that she wanted something unusual for her birthday. Estella assumed she wanted a cake and to go for a picnic at the lake, but she was extremely surprised when Lenatis asked her to run away with her beloved. Meanwhile, as she decided to change the novel in the mansion of Archduke Theodore, that man was suffering from madness. During his gasps, beastly fangs could be seen in his mouth, and he pleaded incessantly for a sorceress. A week has passed since the day Lenatis asked her sister to run away, but Estella refused. Both of them understood perfectly what it meant to run away with a lover, and what could happen afterward. But Lenatis didn't stop trying to persuade her, following her everywhere, and even whispering it to her in her dreams. And it infuriated her that her older sister wouldn't listen to her or run away from home with Emjuel. She loves him. Oh, she really loves him. But Estella always denied they had that kind of relationship and thought her younger sister didn't have anything better to do and would ask her to do something useful. But when the memories of her past life returned to Lenatis, she discovered what her sister truly felt. She actually loves Emjuel deeply, even though he isn't handsome, has no wealth, and isn't in her league. In the original story, Estella sitting in a dark basement cried herself dry out of longing for Mjuel. She couldn't accept her fate as a prisoner of the mad protagonist who was a handsome and rich heir. And now Estella was refusing to run away with Mjuel because she was also worried about her younger sister, who would be left alone. Lenatis assured her that she could work as a servant in a wealthy house, even if she didn't have recommendations, but she is very strong. And those kinds of servants are just what those men need. They won't find anyone better than her. The girl even lifted a pile of huge rocks to prove her strength to her sister, although she didn't doubt it. The only thing left was to start playing the pity card. And sitting down, she burst into tears once again, causing her sister to worry. Estella comforted her as best she could, but she asked her never to bring up that topic again. She wanted to explain something else to her younger sister, but their conversation was abruptly interrupted. The door creaked open, and a not-so-young man entered the room with his head down and a bottle in his hand. The girls got scared and went on guard because it was their father, and apparently he was completely drunk. Continuing. Forward. The man tried to drink from the bottle as he walked, but the liquid spilled from his mouth. His gait was staggering, and he was furious because his daughters were not happy to see him, and he insulted them without mercy. Estella, immediately protecting her sister, explained that they were just busy having dinner, and then cautiously greeted him. Unfortunately, that evil drunk was their father, and in that state, it wasn't unusual for him to attack his daughters with his fists. The girls realized that he had already squandered all the money he had stolen from them days before. The father noticed that Lenatis was staring at him, and instantly began to insult her, furious that she didn't earn a single cent. He was convinced that she had stopped respecting him the moment he crossed the threshold, and he threw a bottle at her. Estella stopped him from continuing, promising that she would talk to her sister and begging him to stop. This helped a little, but he continued to grumble, saying that he spent money on drinking binges because of Lenatis. When he left, she could finally let her tears flow freely, and her body was still trembling with panic and anguish. Estella immediately noticed her condition and ran to her sister to help her, but she assured her that she was fine and hadn't been hurt, although at that moment, something else worried her more. She didn't understand why her older sister wanted to spend her whole life being beaten by their father. Today they were lucky and everything turned out okay, but it all could have ended with a beating. After thinking for a few seconds, Estella proposed that they escape from that horrible man together, but their father doesn't earn a single cent, and if they leave together he will surely chase them. This terrified the older sister, but Lenatis insisted on running away, assuring her that their hardship would be brief. In 1 week she could visit her and find out if Lenatis got a job as a maid. If not, they would leave together. The younger sister confessed that it took a lot of courage to ask for something like that, but she begged Estella to also be brave, and that way they would surely succeed. The girls hugged, and that very night, Estella, as her sister had asked, quickly packed her things. Together in the middle of the night, they went to see Emil, surprising him greatly. But upon seeing the suitcase, he understood everything, because in the last few days, Lenatis had also been pressuring him with the idea of escaping. This boy turned out to be much better than she thought, and he immediately began to take care of her sister. Soon they said their goodbyes, and Estella declared that Lenatis would always be her little one. She knew it would be difficult and asked her to write at any time. In the novel, Estella agreed to undertake the journey to protect her younger sister. This girl had always lived for Lenatis and protected her from their father. That's why the younger one wanted her to be happy, and so she decided to take on the bitter fate that was reserved for her older sister. As they said goodbye, the girls hugged, wishing each other luck and asking one another to be safe. Estella and Emjel departed, while Lenatis watched them leave. For a while, the girl stood alone. Giving in to her inner turmoil, she sat down because her legs were trembling. But the important thing was that her sister was safe, and she now had a crucial matter at hand. Lenatis was determined to put her father behind bars, so he would pay for his sins. In reality, their father didn't hate Estella that much. She suffered only for always being near Lenatis. It was the younger daughter whom the father truly hated, because she looked so much like their mother. Mom died almost instantly after giving birth to her second daughter, and unlike her sister, Lenatis doesn't even remember her face. But now that had nothing to do with her. Upon returning home, Lenatis managed to lock her father in his own room, which obviously infuriated him. Before that, he had slept soundly all night, and upon waking, he became furious, not understanding why the door wouldn't open. According to the plot on that very day, someone was supposed to come and knock on the old door of their house, and when Lenatis went to open it, just as she expected, there stood a young man with a monocle. This boy. The Duke's assistant was looking for a girl with pink hair and couldn't believe she was in such a place. Lenatis already knew the reason for his visit, and even noticed how he began to stare at her. It turns out that in this world, pink hair is an incredible rarity, although the girl in the novel without any memories sensed its rarity. That hair possesses a magical power of enchantment, so the young man who appeared introduced himself as Ordi Ekel and revealed that he works for the Duke. In the novel, he would kidnap the protagonist and force her, under threat, to go with him to the Archduke. Lenatis was not surprised to see him at the door, but asked why Archduke Cario had sent him. The young man asked to speak for a moment and proposed that she go with him. At that instant, her father's screams were heard, as he cursed and insulted his daughters, declaring they would pay for their audacity. The girl even felt uncomfortable. She would have preferred if her father were sleeping at that moment. She explained to the guest that it was just her father, and that he shouldn't pay him any attention. But Orty sensed that the shouting man was locked up, his yells greatly disturbing Lenatis. However, she confessed to the guest that her father gets a bit crazy when he drinks, but it seemed Orty didn't care about that at all, as he had another objective, and explained directly to the girl that she must go with him to the Archduke's mansion. This was exactly what Lenatis needed, and now she could feign surprise. After hesitating for a moment, as if reflecting, the girl accepted. Now she would go to Archduke Theodore's mansion without even wasting time on preparations. Upon arriving, she asked Orty to wait, as she remembered something and needed to clear things up. In the novel, Estella's first encounter with the protagonist took place in a tiny room, but the place they brought her to seemed like a genuine underground prison. Furthermore, 2 guards armed with spears did not leave their side for a single second. Orty ignored the girl's plea, and only reminded her that she had one single mission. Now Lenatis was confused, but she understood Estella's fear, arriving there knowing nothing. The dungeon was only mentioned in the second half of the novel, though it could just be a normal room. Trying to calm herself, the girl suddenly had an idea, but she was obviously pushed against the cell wall. The girl was outraged, but Orty just reiterated her one and crucial task: she must calm a person who is located, confined in this very dungeon. Then the assistant and the guards left and locked the door, leaving her completely alone. Lenatis immediately began to pound on the door, demanding time to prepare for the encounter, but nobody answered. Then she heard the soft creak of another door behind her. Lenatis could end up in this place instead of her sister for one single reason: because she is not her sister. Estella and she only resemble each other in hair color. In every other way, they are polar opposites. They have different eyes and personalities. Furthermore, Lenatis is a fighter, and the Duke surely won't like her, which means he won't fall in love with or become obsessed with her. And a grim ending awaits her. Tastes don't change that easily. She likes muscular guys who can split a log in a single blow. But unfortunately, all the boys in the village were weaker than she was. They struggled to lift 4 sacks at once. One day, Lenatis even jokingly shouted out the window, calling for her strong, monster-like man, though that didn't mean she wished for a boyfriend who was actually a monster, who just at that moment walked into the room, filling her with terror. The girl knew it was the Archduke, but in her eyes, he now looked like a hideous beast. That man is the heir to the title of Archduke, the protagonist of the novel named Theodore de Cario. Just now, by coincidence, he was not in his right mind, and Lenatis's heart sank with fear. Then she remembered that in their first encounter, Theodore had approached Estella quite resolutely. Moreover, he had pounced on her immediately, and now the Archduke was doing the exact same thing, terrifying Lenatis. In the novel, Estella was bewildered by the stark contrast between his handsome face and his crazed red eyes, and while she was bewildered, Theodore drew closer to her. Immediately after he pounced on her, sank his teeth into the heroine's neck and immediately began to drink her blood. Knowing how the plot would progress, the moment the Archduke was about to attack, Lenatis leapt aside in horror. She realized she had almost been literally devoured, and it made her hair stand on end. Theodore only managed to scratch her hand, but she paid it no mind, and now he was standing in the doorway chewing on a piece of blood-soaked fabric, as his head slowly turned toward her. Suddenly he said his prisoner smelled sweet, but it sounded as if it came from hell. However, the fact that he spoke meant he had awakened, and Lenatis decided to seize the moment, putting on a cute face. The girl started asking him to just talk with her. To begin with, he only growled. After all, he was still a monster and wanted to attack her again, but Lenatis ran away. But this is just a small chamber. There's not even anywhere to hide, and she won't be able to run forever. The girl had to get a grip and remembered Emjul's words that when encountering a predator, you must not turn your back or even think of running. You have to look it directly in the eyes and only back away slowly, increasing the distance. But the most important thing is to look at the predator as if you have no fear, even though it seemed difficult. Lenatis decided to try it, and turning toward the Archduke, she glared at him threateningly, and it worked, which surprised her as the monster seemed a bit taken aback. And she began to back away slowly. It seems there are no hopeless situations, and all that remained was to wait for his people to arrive. At that instant, Lenatis slipped and began to fall backward, just as Theodore pounced on her. The girl's entire body trembled with fear again as she realized that Emjul's advice had not worked. At that moment, several drops of her blood fell onto the cold stone floor, but Lenatis managed to throw her hands up in front of her. And with one, she managed to grab Theodore's hand while her other hand got in the way of his jaw, and he sank his fangs into it. The girl was terrified. She could hear him greedily swallowing her blood, and the sounds echoed off the cold walls. Lenatis only had time to mentally say goodbye to her sister, assuming she was about to die in such a foolish way, but then, she felt the Archduke's bite begin to weaken. The girl was surprised, and she didn't understand why he had suddenly calmed down. After all, Teodoro is the protagonist who suffers from madness and acts like a monster. In the novel, he attacked the heroine to quench his thirst, that was all he cared about. But now with Lenatis so close, she could see the wounds around his mouth, noticed broken nails on his hands. He was clearly scratching the walls, fighting against his madness. Now Lenatis felt that this man was suffering alone, and she suddenly remembered her childhood. Her father would lock her in a dark storage room, and she would beg for forgiveness and to be let out. It was dark and scary. Tears wouldn't stop streaming from the little girl, and she called for her sister all the time. She remembered this because Theodore, whom she saw in front of her, was not like the one in the novel. Just like her in the past, he was locked in a dark place. Completely alone, he was an orphan boy, and Lenatis decided to try to show him a little affection. While he continued to suck blood from her hand, she hugged him around the neck and asked him to calm down, assuring him that it didn't hurt. In that instant, she didn't understand why she acted that way, and even thought that Theodore had hypnotized her with his gaze, but they remained like that for a moment, until Lenatis realized that he had simply gone still. She thought he had fallen asleep or fainted and tried to call out to him to get a reaction, but the boy just collapsed gently to the floor, as if the beast inside him had been calmed by her blood. However, in the novel, he tormented Estella until dawn, until she herself fainted, and now he had calmed down and fallen asleep after barely tasting her blood. Lenatis noticed several more differences. She even guessed that she might have mistaken the genre. Just at that moment, a pink bubble appeared in the cell. The girl didn't see it immediately because she was absorbed in admiring the Archduke's handsome face. But when that thing spoke to her, Lenatis's hair stood on end with fright, as if she had seen a ghost. It was a character that definitely did not belong to that genre in the novel Doll. There was no mention of any trace of magical creatures or monsters, and the Cario family suffered from madness generation after generation. And when it happened, their eyes would turn red, which is why it might seem that magic and curses existed in this world. But the book said nothing about that yet. Now in front of Lenatis, a strange pink thing with eyes and a mouth appeared, and then the girl understood that it was a slime, but from the thing's reaction it didn't like that name. It explained that it belonged to the highest species of beings, magical beings, and that the nickname irritated it immensely. Shocked, Lenatis perfectly remembered the description of that creature from her past life, and it was a slime. But she still decided to ask the thing what she should call it so it wouldn't get angry. The bubble smiled and introduced itself as Ezgian, but that information wasn't enough for the girl. She insisted asking what type of being Ezgian belonged to. She apologized for the sudden questioning, explaining that she was human, and her name was Lenatis Gracia. When she asked what Ezgian was, a deathly silence filled the cell for an instant. The girl was now sure it was a slime, and the dungeon filled with Ezgian's indignation. To understand, Lenatis begged it to explain what kind of magical beings they were, and what race they belonged to. There was no answer. The bubble just kept repeating insistently that it was not a slime, but Ezgian, and infuriated, it declared that communication with that human was impossible and turned ready to leave. The girl felt a little embarrassed by her clumsiness. She didn't want to offend the creature. Carefully, she laid the Archduke's head on the floor and decided to catch up with the bubble. But when she looked back there, the creature had already vanished. With a heavy sigh, Lenatis remembered that she wanted to change the plot a little, but it seems she overdid it. Not long ago, the Archduke woke up in his office and immediately felt a strong itching in his throat. Coughing hard, he immediately called for help because he felt truly awful. Lifting his head, Theodore saw that his father was sitting nearby watching him in silence. Then the father stood up and demanded that his son not lose his mind and remember how his older brother died. Theodore must stay strong if he doesn't want to end up the same way. He is strictly forbidden from killing the sorceress, and that was the last thing he heard from his father before losing his mind. And it sounded nothing like advice a father gives his son out of concern or as a warning. The elder Archduke simply uttered a cold warning that in essence was an order. Theodore knew perfectly well that his father felt no affection for him. He had never heard a kind word from his mouth, but he naively hoped that this time would be different. Although this was just a side effect of his confusion from the sudden fangs and the pain of his long claws. They were family, and his father had already gone through this, but he didn't even warn him that the pain would soon subside. Theodore longed to hear those words in that moment. Although it was absurd to expect something like that, the Duke thought that dying would be better, and now asleep, he heard a girl's voice. She was saying that she felt no pain, and for some strange reason it calmed him. Theodore woke up in his room, although it took him a moment to understand where he was. Besides, he felt that the pain had disappeared. At that moment, a distressed assistant approached him. He immediately began to ask how he was feeling, and Theodore noticed that his fangs had disappeared, and his hands were obeying him. Theodore sensed that the sorceress was responsible and immediately asked about her with some guilt. Ordi explained that they had simply left her in the cell, not knowing what to do with her. Suddenly, the Archduke unexpectedly jumped out of bed and ran towards the door, scaring his assistant. He was afraid he had drunk too much blood, as his madness had reached its peak at that moment. For some reason, he was very afraid of having seriously injured her, and upon flinging open the cell door, he saw that the pink-haired girl had her back to him. Theodore was a bit bewildered, and Lenatis explained that she was waiting for him to ask why he was torturing her like this. They brought her here, promising her a place to sleep and food, but she's like a dog in a cage. It's very uncomfortable to sleep on the stone floor, and the air that smells of mold is simply unbreathable. Then she started shouting even louder that even a prisoner they are obligated to give food at least 2 times a day. In that instant, the Duke was stunned. He thought the girl had hit her head. Lenatis was overcome with fury. It enraged her that someone would force another to go hungry. In the morning, they took Lord Theodore from her and left her in this freezing basement, and if she were to starve to death here, she couldn't continue to help. How horrible! In a fit of rage and with the dim light, the girl couldn't make out who was approaching, and when he insinuated that she was not satisfied, his voice sounded like that of a leading man. After calming down a bit, she looked more closely and saw that it was Duke Theodore himself, standing in front of her. She was expecting his assistant, but the young master appeared in person. Why, besides, he looks better. His eyes have regained their color, and it seems he has finally regained consciousness. While she was examining him, Duke Theodore asked why she had suddenly gone quiet, but then he himself understood that she probably was seeing a monster like him for the first time, and to think that last night he seemed to her like a lost child, like a fragile ember in a dark forest. So fragile that Lenatis, without realizing it, tried to protect him. Now he has the look of a rebellious teenager, and if you treat him badly, everything will go very wrong. Theodore thought she was silent out of fear, but those thoughts could turn him into a villain. She didn't want him to take that dark path and told him that last night. He looked like a little bunny. The Archduke didn't understand what his prisoner meant, but she herself realized her mistake. In romance novels, the main characters are usually like predators, so Lenatis apologized to Lord Theodore and took back what she said about the bunny. It's just that bunnies also have red eyes, but they aren't scary. On the contrary, they're very cute, so the Lord also seemed adorable to her, but Theodore found that strange to hear. The girl got completely tangled in her words. The Archduke isn't just adorable. He's a total dreamboat. Besides, as soon as he got better, he immediately looked like the protagonist of a novel. Now he's looking at her with a predatory gaze, and his hoarse voice makes him even more attractive. But Lenatis was glad that Theodore wasn't her type, because she likes big puppy dog types who wag their tails. While she was thinking they weren't a match, the Duke asked her to explain what she had done to him that night. However, Lenatis asked him the same question, pointing to the wound on her hand from which he drank blood. Theodore heard she had no other wounds and was surprised, and she understood that he didn't remember anything because he was out of his mind, although perhaps he would be interested to know how the girl is perfectly fine. This was not good, because if he started to suspect her, he would stop trusting her. He might go looking for another pink-haired girl, specifically one named Estella Gracia. And Lenatis had tried so hard to convince her sister to run away, so she could live a better life far from here. And she began to remember how the protagonist behaved in the novel. After the protagonist drank her blood, remembering that she would faint, Lenatis pretended to feel unwell. As if her head were spinning at the same time, she said that last night, the Duke had drunk too much of her blood, and that had weakened her a lot. Now it was time to faint. But the girl didn't quite understand how to do it. Correctly, it was probably enough to just fall, and she immediately found herself on the floor with a thud. When she fell, she hit her ankle, but she had to endure it and not make a sound. Even though it hurt a lot, she mustn't reveal that she was faking. And Theodore, meanwhile, was standing silently. He probably believed Lenatis then. She heard his order for the servants to take the prisoner to the room. The girl celebrated her acting talent. What a shame to have to stay in this basement. Looking through the slit between her eyelashes, Lenatis examined the footwear and pretended to wake up. The Archduke was squatting in front of her, begging her to wake up, and she said she felt like walking and immediately ran out of the cell, although no one knows what prompted her at that moment, while Theodore didn't understand how she had recovered so quickly. To the point of being able to run, it was impossible after a night in the basement with a monster like him, but he didn't think she was faking. Then he remembered that when she was still unconscious, he had told her that she should get up if she had any awareness, and he understood that this girl definitely didn't know how to fake it. But he found that rather amusing. Theodore was even glad he hadn't hurt her, at least not seriously, although he knew that for a girl abandoned in a dungeon, everything could seem very different. Lenatis wasn't thinking of escaping the mansion, nor would they let her, but she got her own room. The bed was so soft that she almost forgot she had spent the night in the dungeon. She left there with Theodore, and Ordi took her to the guest room, where she would now live. The size of the room was such that it exceeded the area of her entire childhood home. With so much luxury, Lenatis even forgot to complain. Everything was made of expensive materials, plus they fed her and healed her hand. Shortly after, they gave her a beautiful dress. Although it was a maid's uniform, Ordi assigned her the duties of the young duke's handmaiden. She also had to serve him tea, although her main task was to calm his fits of madness, and she would have to agree to wear the uniform constantly, because the master's condition was a secret. But the girl loved the dress, which surprised Ordi a little. Although that situation suited him, Lenatis would never forget the way he looked at her as if she were a fool. The girl loved the bow and the sleeves, puffy sleeves of the dress. Besides being made of a soft and beautiful fabric, she didn't understand how anyone could not want to wear it, especially when she only had 2 new dresses. The first one her mother had sewn a long time ago, and the second one her sister made for her. By buying a beautiful fabric, both were birthday gifts, and that second dress was precisely the one she was wearing now, stained with blood, dust, and dirt, and also torn in some places. She had put it on to look decent in front of Theodore, because it was the best thing she had, and now Ordi insisted that she throw it away, but Lenatis refused, because that would make her sister very angry in that room, Estella was originally supposed to be unconscious on the bed. The family doctor would have been leaning over her, extremely worried about her delicate condition. Now Estella should be fine with Emul. And Lenatis hoped everything was all right with her clutching her new uniform to her chest. The girl continued thinking about her sister for a while. Unable to help it, tears welled up, and again the pink slime appeared, not understanding her crying. Just at that moment, Lenatis felt the tear that was forming in her eye simply evaporate. This surprised her, as did the way the slime entered the room. But he reminded her of his magical lineage. For the great sky and doors are no obstacle. Lenatis deduced that this creature could teleport. She thought that if monsters existed in this world, then logically there could also be magic. Right after Lenatis asked him if Skyen could take her, even for a second, to her sister with a grumpy face, the pink bubble declared that it was impossible. Thinking it was because of yesterday's conversation, the girl apologized for her attitude, but she really needed to see her sister. Then she began to inquire about the reason for the refusal. She even thought it was due to some magical limitation. Maybe she was rejected for not being the protagonist. But Skyen confessed that he doesn't know how to do it. Disappointed. Lenatis was perplexed. Something doesn't add up. How did that slug get here? And he explained that he slipped through a half-open door. He is small, and that allowed him to pass. But now this cast doubt on him being from a great magical lineage. Evidently he is a common slug who later admitted he was following a sweet scent. This seemed strange as there were no sweets here, but that scent guided the slug to the girl yesterday as well. And now he came to the conclusion that this scent comes precisely from the pink-haired girl. He liked that scent so much that without asking he jumped onto Lenatis' knees. Skyen ignored her subsequent questions, repeating endlessly how unparalleled that scent was. Then the girl remembered that the previous night, Duke Theodore had told her something similar. She probably emanates a scent that only non-humans can perceive. She was trying to remember if the novel mentioned anything about scents. Suddenly the slime started to move and enjoy itself on her knees. Like a kitten at that moment, he seemed incredibly adorable, almost to the point of being scary. And this pleasant moment was interrupted by the slime's unexpected proposal to serve her. This instantly infuriated the girl, and she threw the creature far away, which got stuck to the door like a squashed booger sliding down. Skyen began to complain that being her servant was a great honor. But Lenatis was not convinced. Then the slime honestly admitted that he fervently wished to be near the source of that pleasant scent. For that very reason, he had proposed to the girl to serve her, so he could be by her side at all times. Even so, Lenatis' anger only intensified. It would make her seem like a toy for this creature. She doesn't understand how someone can propose that. But she remembered he is not human. Her fury grew when Skyen added that he would support her financially. Because of her stubborn refusal, the girl seemed very annoying to him, and he asked how to proceed. Lenatis proposed simply being friends. Since friends visit each other whenever they want, in a fraction of a second the slime's smile widened. But he didn't understand such audacity. However, he valued Lenatis' courage and accepted her proposition shortly after. A servant knocked on the door of young Lord Theodore's office, extending an envelope and explaining that Lenatis was begging for the letter to be delivered urgently. She wrote it quickly on paper as Ordi was leaving the room and managed to give it to him. Both men read the message, but the meaning of the text seemed very strange to them. Moreover, to the Archduke, it seemed that the text was too long to have been written lightly. Lenatis began by saying she had a couple of questions for him. And first she wanted to know, since when he had been crazy, she also asked him to tell her if he had symptoms before the attack. For example, if his eyes hurt or his teeth itched. She also asked how long the attack lasted, all this to prepare herself well for their meeting in the end. Lenatis asked him to reply to that letter, and while Theodore read, Ordi became furious at her audacity. What infuriated him the most was that the girl dared to call the Lord crazy. Theodore himself thought that this prisoner had hit her head, especially because at the end, she drew strange symbols. But as for Lenatis, it later occurred to her that it was unlikely anyone in this world would know that symbol. The slime just mocked her stupidity, but now she was more worried that her hand hurt in the place of the bite. Perhaps the painkiller had worn off, although Lenatis could simply still be running on adrenaline. He sank his fangs into her arm to drink her blood that she endured. That is already a miracle. Suddenly, Lenatis noticed that the slime was worried about her, which took her by surprise. He even made a little sad face. The girl tried to calm him down, assuring him that nothing hurt. She remembered that it had hurt more when her father threw a stool at her, and she broke it by blocking with her arm. That really hurt, but she endured it, so this bite was nothing more than a trifle. Skyen meanwhile jumped onto her lap again. Thinking she was faking, he tried to stroke her hand. Lenatis wanted to remove him, but then she even liked that he stretched. Like a soft stress ball, she kneaded and stretched him for a while. That helped her calm down. And she even felt that pain lessened still. She was worried that if Theodore had another attack, she would have to offer him her other hand. She didn't want to always feel pain, and to avoid it, she needed to find another solution. Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck her. To prepare blood in advance and store it in bags as if from donors. But it's unlikely that technology exists here. It's a fantasy world with monsters, but without modern medicine. She must devise another way, and Lenatis dove back into the memories of the novel. There in the second half, the protagonist began to share fluids in a different way. And instead of pain, she gradually began to feel pleasure. That other way was for the heroine to become the Archduke's doll. Damn, that was no use to Lenatis. Theodora wasn't her type, and surely was waiting for her. Muscular and tall husband in the future. She needs to find another fluid that is easy to share, and Lenatis decided to experiment with the slime. Proposing that he drink someone's tears, Ezgian declared with disgust and indignation in his voice that he would kill anyone who forced him to do such a thing. Lenatis' next suggestion was to drink some sweat, but if they force the slime to drink that, he will kill that bastard twice. Then the girl understood that no one would like it, and at that moment, Ezgian understood that this lady wanted to get him drunk on her tears and sweat, but Lenatis seemed not to hear his indignation, and continued thinking about the option. Meanwhile, she was choosing between sweat and tears, since for the tears the slime promised to kill only once. The slime got very bored of being ignored by his interlocutor and decided to leave, and Lenatis remembered her sister, whose recent separation had been the saddest event. The girl's thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the door and approaching footsteps. Turning her head that way, she saw that Duke Theodore himself had arrived, and his gaze was strange. The girl was scared to death, not understanding why he had come, and even thought she would soon have an attack. In reality, Theodore only came in to see if she was okay. Besides, she wasn't answering and the door was ajar. He remembered Ordy's story. The atmosphere in her childhood home was not exactly the most encouraging. Her house was very far away on the outskirts of the village, old and deteriorated by time. The furniture and decor weren't much to look at either. Ordy told him that she lived with her sister and an alcoholic father. But when he got there, the father was locked in his room and the sister's whereabouts were unknown. The girl had also told him that the dress she arrived at the mansion in was very valuable to her. Now Theodora was looking at that same dress, which now looked more like an old, worn-out rag. He didn't understand why she was so fond of that dress, until he realized that he himself might have torn it the night before. Now he noticed the prisoner's slightly swollen face, and he supposed she had been crying, and he was intrigued to know why. Deep down, Lenatis was preparing a potion for him to drink later, but she couldn't admit it to him at that moment, and just stated that she thought of her family and became very sad, although that was true. Remembering that her father is a drunkard, Theodoro understood it wasn't because of him, so she was crying for her sister. It seems they were very close, and he understood that the dress the prisoner treasures was a gift from her sister. Lenatis at that moment was burning with nervousness, not understanding why the Duke remained silent, as if he had discovered her plan. She wanted to make up some excuse, when suddenly Theodoro reached out his hand and wiped a tear from her eye. Leaning in a little, he confessed that he was worried about her condition. The girl was paralyzed with surprise. Now everything in her head was complete chaos. It seemed to her that the instant he touched her face stretched on for an entire eternity at once. She feared that the Archduke had realized her plan to use her tears against him. But if it's not about that, then she doesn't understand why he is worried, although protagonists have always been perceptive. Now Lenatis didn't know what to do. She even thought of apologizing, although Theodore's suspicions were not yet confirmed. The easiest solution now was to play dumb, and she simply asked what he was doing there. Then she remembered the letter she sent through Ordy, and she was interested to know if the Duke had received it. Theodore admitted that he had, but in doing so, some questions arose for him regarding it. He took a sheet of paper from his pocket, and fear once again seized the young woman, afraid she had written something unforgivable. But then the Archduke pointed to some strange scribbles and symbols, asking what they were. And Lenatis explained that they were smiley faces. The girl even showed what they looked like on her face, closing her eyes. But Theodore still seemed a bit bewildered. At that moment, Lenatis saw for the first time in her life the face of a person who understood absolutely nothing. Still, she was glad that they had changed the subject this way, and had completely forgotten about the tears. Afterwards, Theodoro took a bag of money from his pocket that should be enough for a new dress. Let's say it's compensation for the damage to the outfit Lenatis is wearing, the Duke openly admitted, knowing how valuable that dress is to her. That's why he gave her extra money. Judging by the bag, it contained about 2 million lunas. And the girl stated that the dress isn't worth that much. This money is enough not just for a better dress, but for about 20 rather luxurious court dresses. Besides, this sum is double her salary, and her family could live on it for 2 months. Lenatis couldn't accept so much money. Thinking it might be a trap, she said it was too much, but Theodore just stated that money can't measure what is valuable to the heart. His words sounded sincere, and Lenatis gratefully declared that she would accept this compensation. At the same time, she thought about saving it in a piggy bank, so that later she could live happily with her sister. And the Archduke, after such a gift, hoped that his prisoner would no longer be sad to the point of tears. The girl was truly happy to receive that enormous sum, and thanked the Lord once more. Theodore even liked that this beauty was now smiling, even though just before she was crying. Now she seemed like an enigma from whom one never knows what to expect. And he still remembers how she called him a cute little bunny. After the Archduke gave her 2 million lunas, the girl began to train. 2 hours a day to work undercover. The rest of the time, Lenatis dedicated herself to what is called self-care. In other words, she simply rested. She spent her days eating and sleeping. What would seem to anyone like the job of their dreams? Lenatis could live like this forever. She even began to feel a little ashamed. In front of her sister, and once more before sleeping. Thinking of Estelle, Lenatis calculated that exactly 10 days had passed. Theodore still hadn't called her to drink blood, and that calm was beginning to make her nervous. The silence in the room was interrupted by a whisper, and turning around, Lenatis saw that Ezgien had come to her again. For some reason, the slime's little face looked disgusted. Although the girl hadn't said anything to him yet, it was clear to Ezgien that she was again worried about that male, whom the slime had spied on by mistake. Lenati knew that Theodora was sleeping, but she was instantly indignant because the slime called him a male. At first, she thought Ezgien might be female, but that probably wasn't what was really going on. Then she explained that people are not called males or females, and that he should at least call the Lord a man. The pink mass felt, and then proudly declared that he too was a male slime. When it turned out that Ezgien was a male, Lenatis became sad, and even felt a little uncomfortable, but that wasn't what worried her most, and she simply lay down, allowing the slime to stay on the bed. The next morning at the mansion turned out to be quite lively. A young maid entered Lenatis' room and began to call her softly from the doorway, trying to wake her up. Lenatis herself was murmuring in her sleep, calling for her sister, when she heard a girl's voice asking her to wake up. But as she sat up abruptly, she felt completely confused, not understanding what was happening or why someone else was in her room. In front of her, she saw a rather frightened young woman with 2 pigtails and eyes full of pure shock. When Lenatis asked who she was, the maiden explained that her name was Claire and that she worked there as a maid. Then she explained that Archduke Theodore was returning from inspecting his lands, and all the staff had to go out to greet him. Claire was referring to the father of Theodore, the current head of the family, and a very famous man throughout the country. Moreover, he possesses power almost equal to that of the emperor. But he is even better known for his relentless cruelty. The families who dared to confront him were annihilated, the men sold as slaves and the women to brothels. On the battlefield, Theodore showed not a shred of mercy and beheaded all the members of the royal family. From the neighboring kingdom, he hung the heads on the castle gates. And in that country, there is no one who doesn't know the Archduke. Lenatis obediently went out to meet the others to receive her for all practical purposes. Direct superior. The Archduke advanced with a peacock's strut, instilling terror in everyone. No one dared to look up suddenly. He stopped and examined her with a look so terrifying that a shiver ran down her spine. His gaze was bone-chillingly piercing. But he understood that she was the sorceress herself. Lenatis didn't know where to hide. She hadn't done anything wrong. But he looked at her like she was scum, even though she had overslept today, and Claire had to run to wake her up. Even Orty got angry about it, but she got ready at lightning speed, and managed to arrive before the Archduke made his appearance. Now she felt that this man was going to punish her for something, when in reality she was helping his son. Suddenly, Cario simply turned around, causing a slight breeze, but Lenatis was now even more terrified. She heard him call her the sorceress. His voice was not loud, but it inspired absolute dread. A chill ran through the young woman's body, but she didn't dare say a word. Lenatis just watched him walk away, when Claire instantly advised her to lower her head. The fact that the girl was late and on top of that dared to look at the Lord foreshadowed a good scolding from Lord Orty. He, in fact, was watching Lenatis from afar with considerable anger, but at that moment, she was worried about something entirely different. The Archduke said just one sentence, but with such a contemptuous tone, looking at her as if she were a useful tool. The young woman still felt her body trembling, but now also with rage. She did not want to meet that man again later. Lenatis began to instruct Theodore's nanny named Rita, and asked her to remember everything she did. Furthermore, the time had come for the young woman to serve the tea herself, as she had been learning every day. What's more, her first time would be serving tea to the Lord Theodore, and now she would have more worries. The nanny first knocked on his study, announcing that they were bringing him tea, but he asked not to be disturbed after saying he didn't want any tea. Lenatis thought she could go back to having fun, but she suddenly noticed that the young Archduke's voice sounded subdued. Rita, the nanny, understood that the master was not in the mood for tea, and suggested they come back tomorrow. The maids withdrew, but the girl couldn't get the young master out of her head. To satisfy her curiosity, she asked the nanny if she knew the reason, but she thought that Theodora was turning into a demon again, and then they would be lost. Suddenly, Rita decided to tell the newcomer, since she would be working there, and explained that the young master's mood changed because of the Archduke's return. Theodoro and his father do not get along, so when Cario returns, his spirits plummet. That relationships between rich people can be bad sounds strange, but it's normal. Lenatis' relationship with her father wasn't the best either. Upon hearing this, Rita stopped as if she wanted to hear the whole backstory. Then the girl confessed that she had an older sister thanks to whom she was happy. Then she asked if the young master had other relatives, but the nanny reacted strangely. Rita fell silent for a moment, and Lenatis immediately remembered something from the novel. Master Theodore's biological mother hated him and did not recognize him as her son. She constantly cast him out and even wished for his death, considering him a monster. But in the novel, the Archduke's wife was only mentioned in passing, and nothing more was said apart from that one episode, although it was logical, considering that Theodore's relationship with her was very bad. The nanny also told this to Lenatis, and begged her not to speak with the young master about his parents under any circumstances. Rita also felt a bit of pity for Theodore having to live in that family, and Lenatis remembered that her father was also a despot. But thanks to her sister, she endured it all. But Lord Theodore has no relatives on whom he can rely. How terrible. It was strange to know that he was cruel and cold, that he tormented the heroine, and at the same time was a deeply wounded man. Even stranger for Lenatis was that she was beginning to worry so much about him. What a twist. At that moment, the young master felt a sudden craving for a mood-lifting tea. Lenatis, taking advantage of being free from work, headed to her secret hiding spot in the garden. Someone had recommended it to her, and there she could take a quiet nap after enjoying having time for it. In this place, in the shade of a broadleaf tree on soft grass, it was pleasant to sleep at any time. Normally no one comes here, and it's an excellent place to hide from the scorching sun. Lenatis was sure that in a place like this, even she would have sweet dreams. The young woman was beginning to doze off when she heard someone counting. She almost had a heart attack from the shock. Calming down a bit, she looked through the bushes to see who dared to interrupt her rest. Pushing aside some branches, the girl saw a muscular man training with a sword and counting at the same time. During his training, the man turned slightly, and Lenatis could clearly make out his face. She recognized him instantly and was in shock, not understanding what that guy was doing there. The fellow continued his exercises as if nothing was wrong, but Lenatis didn't move from her hiding spot either. When their eyes met, that man looked at her as if he were going to kill her and throw her into a dungeon. It was none other than the knight. Instruct Glasses, the one who carried Theodore. But why was he training alone? Lenatis didn't understand why he had shown so much hostility. From the moment they met, but now he has no valid reason to object, so she decided to simply go back. Although her legs wouldn't move, and her eyes were once again fixed on his amazing and irresistible muscles. Lenatis had never seen muscles like that, not even in the village, and she liked them a lot. If the boy were 5 centimeters taller. In the dungeon, she was disoriented, and it was too dark to make anything out clearly. Now his face seemed very attractive to her. She was impressed by his red hair and blue eyes. Suddenly, Lenatis realized that once again, she was thinking about him too much, so much so that she didn't even notice when the knight finished his training and began to approach her, pushing aside the branches she had hidden behind again. He asked what the sorceress was doing there alone. When Lenatis looked at his face again, she unconsciously said his name out loud. The knight stared at her even more intently, not understanding how she could know his name. Instruct Glasses is the hero of that novel, with distinctive features like red hair and blue eyes, and he wasn't just Theodora's bodyguard. He fell in love with Astelia at first sight and tried to help her escape, but his attempt failed, and a tragic end awaited him. Now Lenatis, to get out of the situation, explained that Lord Orty had told her about him. Instruct kept looking at the girl as if he were going to kill her, even though she liked this character in the novel. This knight did not believe that a sorceress could calm Theodora's madness. Astelia's pacification only increased his obsession and madness towards her, and watching Theodora become crazier, Instruct did not believe in the sorceress's magical fluids. If he had such thoughts even about Astelia, with whom he fell in love, what then could be said of Lenatis? And now she remembered again how she suffered in the dungeon, which made her angry again. And this guy surely won't help her. He is not in love with her like he was with Astelia in the novel. Now he wanted to know why she was hiding, and she explained that she had some free time, and decided to take a nap. Suddenly, Instruct declares that he already knows everything, and adds that he is not interested in girls like her. He thought she had feelings for him. After all, he is handsome, but Lenatis rushed to deny it. She knew he wasn't interested in her. She felt the same way about him and asked him to listen to her. Then she proudly declared that for her to like him, he would need to be 10 centimeters taller, and he also needs 20 more kilograms of muscle to fit her tastes, and that is the minimum requirement for Lenatis to pay him a little attention. Her words suddenly struck the knight's ego. He didn't understand how someone could not like him. After saying everything, the girl prepared to leave, but Instruct asked her to wait. He reached his hand out to her, and even shouted to stop her, and right then, Lenatis turned around terrified. For a moment she thought she saw her monstrous father, ready to skin her alive. She immediately crouched down, trembling with fear, and began to beg him for forgiveness. The knight instantly withdrew his hand as if he had been burned. He didn't understand her reaction since he hadn't done anything to her. He wanted to clarify the situation, but Lenatis was struggling at that moment with a choking fit from the fright. Recovering a little, the girl explained that she had gotten scared because that was how her father would hit her again and again. Then she asked why Instruct had called out to her, but he didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be thinking about what to say like a schoolboy in front of a beauty. And then he let out that she had a little leaf in her hair. Lenatis thought it was just an excuse, but she touched her hair to check then. The knight suddenly grabbed her by the shoulders, but now she didn't feel fear but bewilderment. Instruct asked her to stay and then let her go. Did he not need her anymore? Although in reality she was planning to ask him if there were any cures for Lord Teodoro. When Glasses heard about the cursed bloodline of the Oscario, he dismissed it as nonsense. But upon seeing the changes in Lord Teodoro, he understood it was no exaggeration. And now, before Lenatis left, Instruct wanted to know if she had really managed to calm the Lord. The girl pretended not to understand his question, but she immediately signaled him to be quiet, which left him somewhat bewildered. He explained that they would have to see each other often, since he was Lord Teodoro's bodyguard, and she didn't like that he called her a sorceress. Then she introduced herself as Lenatis, Gracia, and asked that he call her by her name. Out of pure courtesy, the knight also told her his full name. Although the girl already knew it, they still shook hands, but Instruct doubted that such a small girl could save Lord Theodoro. Shortly after, Lenatis had to bring tea to the young master again. She was very nervous and didn't know what to do. She couldn't believe that was the only solution. Her anxiety was so great that tears welled up in her eyes again, then slipping down her cheeks. After serving tea a couple of times under Rita's supervision, Lenatis finally got permission to serve it alone. And on the way, she decided to spit in his cup. It was her chance to make him drink her bodily fluids. Besides, in the novel, Teodoro and Estella kissed many times so saliva should work. But for some reason, Lenatis felt guilty in that moment. Thinking it over, the young woman believed that Teodoro would be better off if she prevented him from becoming a monster. Opening the lid of the teapot, she gathered saliva in her mouth again, believing that this would help the master. Just at that moment, she heard his voice behind her asking what she planned to do. Out of fright, Lenatis almost choked on her own saliva and her heart skipped a beat. Nevertheless, she explained that it was tea time, and that she had brought him a cup. Upon entering his room, the young woman began to prepare his tea, just as she had been taught. Meanwhile, she discreetly glanced at his eyes, and confirmed they were violet. Then she looked at his nails. They were impeccable. Nothing indicated he was transforming into a monster. Theodore also remained calm without any sign that he was about to have a fit of madness. This time, Lenatis didn't manage to add her fluids, but she still has many opportunities ahead. Besides, she noticed his fondness for reading, and if he continued like this, he would be fine for a while. From the book he was holding, the girl understood that it was a poetry anthology. She never understood poetry, or what people saw in it to like it. For a moment, Lenatis didn't see Theodore reading or turning the pages, but when she looked up, she saw him staring at her, and didn't know how long he had been like that. Suddenly, the Archduke asked if she liked books, as he noticed she was looking at them. In reality, Lenatis was monitoring his condition, but she couldn't admit it to him, and she simply explained that she didn't like books much, because they made her sleepy. In the past, she had read some motivational and interesting books, but she doubts they exist here. Besides, in her current situation, her family couldn't afford such an expensive luxury. Theodore found books interesting, and didn't understand how they could make one sleepy. Then he became curious to know what she liked without taking his eyes off her. This amazed Lenatis, as Aunt Rita never looked her in the eye, and now he was talking a lot and waiting for answers with an almost obsessive insistence. She thought he was asking about her hobbies like horseback riding, because he only loves his sister. And suddenly she declared that she loved eating delicious things, which is why she liked living there so much. Because there was so much tasty food there. She tried a steak for the first time, and recently discovered they are also made from lamb. Oh, and the fish Lenatis didn't know it could be so delicious grilled like a steak. Teodoro had a hard time understanding how eating could be a hobby, and she knew it too, but the Archduke smiled, determined. To continue with the topic his sorceress had started, and admitted there was a reason many called him a gourmet. Pointing to a chair, he invited her to sit and asked her which dish she had liked the most. Lenatis was a little bewildered, but sat down in the plush seat and searched her memory. Recently, she had seen something called pudding for the first time, a dessert they prepared in the kitchen. Unfortunately, she couldn't try it because it wasn't her turn. What an injustice. Pudding is expensive, and they don't make much of it. And what's left over is given first to the high-ranking staff. Teodoro understood that the servants of higher rank had eaten it all, so Lenatis was left with none. She continued, saying that yesterday she had tried a bit of a chicken dish and had loved it. At that moment, Teodoro corrected her. It wasn't actually chicken but pheasant. He had eaten it too. Lenatis's face changed with surprise. She understood that there were many different dishes, but what surprised her most was that now, talking to this man wasn't scary at all. On the contrary, she felt blissful, and was intrigued if Theodore was experiencing the same thing. Several hours passed since their chat, and a deep night covered the entire estate. Theodora watched the dark sky from the window, remembering the sorceress talking about delicious food. Suddenly, he felt a sudden rush of blood to his head. His hands trembled and his vision blurred. Just at that moment, Ordi, his assistant, knocked on the door asking for permission to enter, and the Lord's daze vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Ordi announced from the door that he had a message, and after taking a deep breath, Theodore allowed him to enter. As the assistant crossed the threshold, he noticed that his master had turned slightly pale, and became worried about his health, but he assured him that he was fine, and asked him to explain what had happened, remembering the reason for his visit. Ordi announced that Countess Pablo would visit him tomorrow after lunch with Duchess Grand. She asked the Lord to prepare for tea. This message from the Countess came as a personal request, which was somewhat strange. Formally, the Countess was an advisor to Theodore's mother, but in reality she was a candidate for his engagement. Theodore's engagement was rumored. At first there were many candidates, but the list was narrowed down to 3. Theodore didn't know the candidates and wasn't concerned. He planned to send her to a separate house. Now he had to meet with the Countess, for which he had to prepare beforehand. He asked the assistant to prepare a clean bath, and that when Lady Pablo arrived to guide her discreetly to the bedroom. Ordi was a little surprised, but the Archduke hurried him and hinted that he would not be having tea with her in his house. The assistant didn't fully understand, but obeyed immediately, and went to prepare what had been ordered. Finally, Theodore added that everything should be prepared according to the rules. After bowing, Orty left the master's bedroom, who sank back into his thoughts, remembering his mother. To her, he was not a son, but a puppet that could be sold dearly, maintaining her position. But it's not clear if he was lucky to be at least a puppet. His father didn't even think of selling him. He only thinks of him as someone from whom to create a mannequin, an obedient one, and he might desire Teodoro's death more than his mother. And if it weren't for the annoying questions about the funeral or inheritance that would have been his fate since that day, the only reason Theodore is alive is because he simply cannot die. That same night, Sigurjon appeared again before Lenatis and instantly shouted upon seeing that the girl wanted to eat poisoned food. Lenatis was a little surprised, since the Lord had told her that if all the poison was removed, the food was fit for consumption. It will be safe if the little bag and the poisonous particles are removed. It's like removing a scorpion's tail and frying it. The slime didn't understand why one would fry a scorpion. Sometimes people truly bewildered it, but Lenatis declared that not even a monster should eat only crickets and drink dirty water. At that point, the slime interrupted her, reminding her that it was a high-ranking demon and demanded respect. Then, puffing up its esgion, it threatened not to speak to her if she continued with that attitude, but this only made Lenatis happy since the slime finally fell silent and she could sleep in peace. And 1 minute later, she herself resumed the conversation, determined to share a brilliant idea. She admitted that she felt very comfortable talking with Lord Theodore, that despite everything, he was noble and not at all terrifying. He turned out to be a completely different person, nothing like the image that Lenatis had of him from the book. Besides, she believed she wouldn't feel so at ease with all aristocrats. The next day, Countess Pablo visited Theodore and immediately praised his tea for its exquisite aroma. She then confessed that she had asked someone if the Grand Duke used good tea, instantly apologizing if the comment sounded abrupt. But Teodoro didn't care. He knows nothing about tea. It was Lenatis who had to serve the tea. She felt terribly uncomfortable at that very moment, unable to understand what had happened to the atmosphere since the Countess was invited. But despite everything Lenatis noticed, she was a beautiful girl with light shining hair. Her smile radiated aristocratic elegance, and her aura was somewhat reminiscent of Estella. Pablo began to talk about Count Gente, who had recently built a large greenhouse with very expensive tulips. Lenatis didn't want to be there anymore. She just wished to serve the tea quickly and get out of that place as soon as possible. While serving the drink, the young woman noticed the Duke's hand was trembling slightly. How strange. Even if he were interested in the Countess, he wasn't the type to tremble in front of a lady, although if he liked her a great deal, Theodore would surely lock her in a cage. Just then, Lenatis noticed out of the corner of her eye that her master's eyes were turning red. The young woman was terrified. If his madness manifested there, the Countess could get hurt, who, oblivious to everything, continued to laugh flirtatiously as if nothing was wrong. Lenatis gathered her courage and blurted out that today was not the best day for tea. The Countess's face changed instantly. In that world, there is a clear line between social classes. Without a compelling need, no maid could speak to an aristocrat without permission. But Lenatis did have that compelling need, and took the liberty of warning the Countess, who should have been angry, but strangely just smiled sweetly, as if she had been flattered. Then she told Lord Theodore that they had finished their tea so the maid should leave. But it seems Lenatis had no intention of giving up, and declared that the young master was not feeling well. She wanted to tell her that if Lady Pablo didn't leave now, she would be in serious trouble, but she expressed herself more tactfully, while shielding the Duke with her own body, and repeated that he was so unwell, he could barely respond. Then she begged the Countess again to leave. For some reason it worked. Standing up, the lady promised to visit Theodore another time. The Countess headed for the exit, and Lenatis immediately turned to the young master to see how he was. At that moment, Lady Pablo glanced back and did not like what she saw out of the corner of her eye at all. Finally, she left, and Lenatis tried to call out to the Duke to get him to at least say something. His condition was worsening, and the girl understood that she now needed to somehow give him her bodily fluids. She thought again about spitting into the tea and immediately reached out to take his cup, but Teodoro grabbed her by the arm. He was already starting to grow fangs, and he brought them close to the girl's neck. Lenatis closed her eyes, preparing for the young master's bite. But a couple of seconds passed, and she felt absolutely nothing. Upon opening her eyes, she saw him slumped on the sofa, struggling with all his might. He still held her hand, trying to control his body and his madness. Lenatis understood that he was just trying to overcome an impossible curse. Again, she saw that expression on his face, as if he felt guilty. Reaching her hands out to him, she spoke, but the Duke remained silent, staring at the floor. Understanding his difficulty, the young woman decided to help him, and hugging him, she kissed him. She instantly realized she had made a moral mistake. They hadn't even held hands, and they have no relationship whatsoever. She felt afraid, not knowing what to do now. In the novels she read in her past life, the male lead would take the initiative, but Theodore was incapable of that now. And one of the romantic moments from the book came to Lenatis's mind. Now she felt something strange but pleasant, as if a torrent of pure energy was spreading through her body. And she continued kissing him, feeling his fangs, which were small. Apparently the madness had not fully manifested. Now to Lenatis, Theodore seemed more like a small puppy than a monster, and she even found him cute. The girl immediately calmed herself, as it was no time for such thoughts. She understood what could follow, and she pulled away a little from Lord Theodore. His eyes were still red, and he just gripped the girl's hands tighter. After that, he kissed her himself. Lenatis even worried that it would be difficult for her to catch her breath like that. However, Theodore still wouldn't let her go, and at the same time she stopped resisting. She understood that all of this was for the treatment. She was just sharing her fluids to cure his madness. But this couldn't last forever, and when Theodore's grip loosened a little, the girl pulled away at that instant. She felt something strange on her lips, as if 2 huge sausages were stuck to them. It turns out Theodore had bitten her, and sucked so much blood that her lips swelled up enormously in a short time. Upon seeing the slime, Lenatis got a little scared, until she explained everything that had happened. Theodore himself suddenly fainted after drinking enough fluids. Yordi took care of him. Now Sween decided to ask the girl to bring it food, but obviously, she was in no mood for that at the moment. The slime got furious and jumped on her head, insisting on what it wanted. And Lenatis thought that even in prison, one's character is crucial for the process of regaining consciousness. What's more, before fainting, Theodore had a strange expression on his face, just as he was beginning to return to his normal state. Lenatis didn't know what it was, and besides, now she was more worried about her numb lips. And shortly after, when Countess Pablo returned home, she unleashed a fit of rage there. She threw everything she could find, not understanding how the maid had dared to offend her, and in the presence of Duke Teodoro no less. The Countess was not going to forgive this under any circumstances. The next morning, when the sun's rays entered Lenatis's room and reached her bed, she began to wake up. Without opening her eyes, she felt something soft with her hand, and then saw it was a slime. It woke up too, and yawning asked her why Lenatis had gotten up so abruptly. But the girl had no time for long explanations. She was in a hurry to check if Lord Teodoro was all right. She quickly changed into her uniform and was about to leave, but Sween asked her to wait a minute. The girl obeyed, thinking it might be something important, but it turned out the slime was demanding breakfast. Lenatis just winked at it and explained that, being a great demon, it could take care of its own breakfast. The girl walked very quickly down the hallway. She was almost running. The last time she saw him, Teodoro seemed to have calmed down, but she needed to see his condition with her own eyes. First, she decided to find out everything from Yordi, when suddenly a maid stopped her. Turning around, Lenatis didn't recognize the maid. She didn't know everyone on that estate yet, and the maid immediately informed her that someone was looking for the pink-haired girl in the courtyard. This surprised Lenatis. She started to ask who and why, but the maid wasn't sure if she should tell her everything right away. She just explained that the newcomer should hurry, so as not to receive a good scolding later. Then she turned abruptly and left. It seems she's another person who believes the rumors about the pink-haired sorceress. Lenatis didn't understand why they avoided her so openly when she didn't even know how to use spells. Anyway, she decided to find out who was waiting for her. Although no one would be looking for her in that castle, she was intrigued to know who it could be. For a second she remembered her sister but doubted she would come. It could well be someone who also believes the rumor of the pink-haired sorceress like that man. But Lenatis feared they would ask her to make a prediction or prepare a magic potion. What terrified her most was the idea that they might ask her to cast a curse on someone. And as she reflected on this, she didn't notice a maid approaching from behind, who grabbing her by the hair began to pull her down. She immediately felt an oppressive atmosphere, and then saw the enraged face of this maid in front of her. But Lenatis wasn't completely disconcerted. She grabbed the stranger by the hand, trying to free her hair, and demanded to be let go. Her physical strength helped the young woman greatly in this, and she twisted her opponent's hand, throwing her aside. Now, Lenatis looked furiously at the one who had dared to attack her and wanted to teach her a lesson. The maid was in shock, not understanding that inhuman strength. And at that moment, the Countess's voice rang out, demanding that the others be called. She also scolded her maid for not being able to bring a girl half her size to her knees. The Countess approached, hiding her face under a parasol, but Lenatis recognized that voice immediately. And then when Lady Pablo raised the parasol, it only confirmed her suspicions, although she pretended to have arrived there by chance. Immediately after, she attacked Lenatis, furiously claiming how she had dared to throw her out of there, even confessing that she felt insulted, and that she began to plot how to murder her to feel better. Lenatis quickly tried to explain that she had no intention of throwing the Countess out. Something urgent had simply come up, but the lady declared that no one dared to insult her in the presence of Lord Theodore. Regardless of the circumstances, the young woman just sighed deeply, not knowing how to explain the situation, without revealing the young master's secret. Just at that moment, the maid grabbed her by the hair and threw her to her knees. While Lady Pablo became enraged that she spoke without permission, demanding that Lenatis stay on that dirty floor, and the girl felt the maid pressing her down harder, downward. But now she understood that Lady Pablo didn't give a damn about the situation. She was just venting her frustrations. One might think this lady was in pain, but now Lenatis was left with only one option. She immediately shook off the maid's hand, although she didn't get up from her knees. Looking at the one who had held her down, she cursed her mentally, hoping to get revenge somehow. But at that very moment, she needed to ask the Countess for forgiveness. Pablo to improve the situation a little. Without raising her head, Lenatis declared that she was sorry, and acknowledged that she had been wrong. The Countess was a little shocked, but continued to silently watch the pink-haired girl. Lenatis understood this wasn't enough. Surely the lady wanted to hit her. Since she had been separated from her father, no one had ever hit her. The people here had even seemed kind to her, which is why Lenatis forgot that not everyone is good, and Lady Pablo was intrigued that she was no longer apologizing. Her maid caught the hint and pounced on the poor girl to stop her from acting smart. She narrowed her eyes, preparing for the imminent blow, but nothing happened, and she grew curious about what had stopped the maid from attacking her. It turns out that just at that moment, the knight instruct approached and stopped the wicked woman's hand. He demanded an explanation of what was happening while Lenatis was in shock, not understanding where glasses came from. He also declared that this place is an extension of the Cario house, and outsiders cannot just enter as they please, releasing the frightened maid's hand. He ordered her to leave immediately, but she just shouted that he couldn't give her orders, pointing to the great importance of her mistress. It seemed the knight was just now noticing the countess, and with a calm voice he apologized. He explained that he only sees the sword, not the person, and that he had no idea who that lady was. Immediately after, he introduced himself with all courtesy as the personal knight of Lord Theodore. He then begged for their understanding as he was only concerned with the security of the property. Lady Pablo smiled at him sweetly and introduced herself with a slight flirtation, even revealing that she had tea with Lord Theodore yesterday, invited by the Duchess Lenatis herself. Did not recognize the lady who had stared at her with fury. Her attitude had changed in an instant, probably because Instruct is close to the Lord. And the Countess alleged that there was an unfortunate incident during tea, and that she had now come to give instructions to the maid, who had been the culprit of said incident. Lenatis knew the lady was lying shamelessly, but also that her word against hers was worthless. She wanted to shout to the knight that she was innocent, but the words refused to come out, and he calmly told her that he understood a lady's feelings. How considerate. Neither of them imagined that in reality Lenatis was trying to save the Countess from Theodore's madness. If her little sister Estella were there, she would surely support her with all her might. Tears threatened to fall, but she couldn't give in. She had to endure it, bear it all alone. Suddenly, she felt Instruct's hand helping her up, assuring her that his lord valued his people. So if Lady Pablo wished to be one of them, it was important that she knew that detail. The Countess found it unusual that a mere maid could be considered one of the young master's people. At that moment, Instruct extended his hand toward Lenatis, indicating for her to offer hers immediately. She didn't understand why, but she doubted he had bad intentions, so she obeyed his silent request. Then Glasses pulled her closer with more force, stating that a maid can be more important to a lord. Blushing bright red, Lenatis didn't understand what this knight was babbling about, and he was asking her to understand the meaning of his words, if she wished to be a someone to Lord Theodore in the future. Lenatis trembled with fear while the knight just smiled, waiting for the Countess's response. He only managed to provoke her further, and that terrified the pink-haired girl. Lady Pablo's expression truly changed again, but she still showed no aggression. However, from her appearance and the oppressive atmosphere alone, Lenatis wished the earth would swallow her whole. She didn't understand why the Knight Instruct had decided to go so far. This could end very badly. But she was supported by the fact that he was of noble origin, and perhaps a thorn in the young Countess's side. That encouraged her a little. And then she saw that Lady Pablo simply turned around and prepared to leave. In the end, she only declared that in the future, she would ask Lord Theodore directly about this. Furthermore, she considered that the foolish maid had received enough instruction so she could now return peacefully. As she left, Lady Pablo shot Lenatis, a warning look indicating that this would not be her last instruction for some time. The girl looked with fear at the departing Countess, and the knight finally let her go. Lenatis didn't know what to do now. Instruct had said so many things that things would surely go badly for her after this. She wanted to explain to him that with his chatter, he had made a mistake, but he calmly asked if she was all right. Although upon seeing her appearance, he understood that not everything was fine. She had chapped lips and many wounds on her face. He also noticed that her face was swollen, and her entire palm was full of scratches. He decided to heal it all at once, grabbing the still scared and shaken girl. The Knight Instruct dragged her behind him. Lenatis had no choice but to follow, glancing at his broad back. Now she understood the feelings of those who fall in love with adorable side characters. Meanwhile, Duke Theodore was trying to put his own thoughts in order. All the previous attacks had been confusing, but this time he remembered everything clearly, and it seemed strange to him. He had just woken up and was feeling confused, but he went to look for the pink-haired sorceress. At the same time, he thought the clarity remained because the madness had not managed to take complete hold of him. He needed to talk to Lenatis, but when he arrived at her room, he heard shouts and another familiar voice. It was clearly Instruct's voice asking the girl to open her mouth wider, and wild thoughts crossed the Duke's mind. In a momentary outburst, Theodore threw the door open to find out what was happening in there, but he did not expect at all to see his personal knight healing the wounds of his sorceress Lenatis. She was scared to death when Theodore burst into the room, but she reacted instantly, and although she didn't understand how he had gotten there, she asked how he was feeling. Theodore himself felt something strange upon seeing the knight, smearing a healing cream around her mouth. Instruct looked visibly bewildered, although what was happening was not his fault, and the Duke, upon understanding the situation, felt embarrassed for having misinterpreted everything at first. He then decided to leave them, asking them to continue. with what they were doing before. The knight still wanted to ask the Lord what had happened while the young woman began to suspect. In the hallway, Ordi found Theodore with a very worried expression. Not finding his lord resting in bed, he became frightened, not knowing what had occurred. He then explained that everyone had been looking for the Lord for a long time, and that he was very worried about his health. The Duke simply walked past his assistant in silence, who reached a hand out to him, fearing he might feel unwell again. Then Theodore turned, showing the healthy gleam in his eyes, and stated that he was perfectly fine. But his flushed face greatly unsettled Ordi, who insisted that his lord return to his room and call a doctor. He even suggested eating something light and nutritious so his body could fight the illness. After taking a few steps, Theodore asked for pudding to be brought to him, which greatly surprised the assistant. The Duke had never eaten anything like that before, but he just repeated his request in a more threatening tone. It turned out that the pudding was for Lenatis, who was incredibly delighted upon seeing it. One of the maids, Claire, handed it to her, and the young woman thought they must have had guests, since there was leftover pudding, even though they wouldn't even serve it when the Countess visited. The maid clarified that the Duke had ordered that pudding. He normally doesn't like sweets, but today he asked for 20 to be prepared. He ate one himself, so now the servants would each receive one, including Lenatis. Claire brought it personally, hoping for a miraculous recovery for the sorceress. Lenatis noticed that Claire was afraid of her at first, but now treats her with complete calm. But what about Claire? When she made a mistake, Ordi would scold her, and Lenatis would suffer the consequences, so their paths crossed often. Bringing them closer in an unexpected way, Claire believed that Ordi scolded out of concern, ignoring the real reason. Theodore, and upon giving her the dessert, she wished her a good rest. Preparing to leave, she even advised her to be more careful and watch her steps in the future. Lenatis lied about a simple fall, hiding the wounds from her fierce battle. She used the same excuse with the knight instruct, avoiding uncomfortable questions and protecting the Duke. Lenatis understood that she wasn't as alone as she thought. Just as a slime appeared, terrified by her appearance, seeing the pieces of bandage on her swollen face, he started to ask her what had happened, so she wouldn't have to make up excuses. The girl just suggested they eat a pudding together, assuring him it was delicious. Slime didn't understand how she could be happy about a sweet looking like that, an appearance he compared to that of a monster. But Lenatis understood that this was his way of showing concern, and all because she fed him morning and night. Suddenly Ezgian indignantly declared that his servant shouldn't look like that, something that bewildered the girl. Then he began to question her about who had done that to her. As if he wanted to take revenge, Lenatis confessed that yesterday she had to kick the Countess out of the room. But it seems she got offended and came today to get even. Ezgian wanted to run off to find the scoundrel, but Lenatis begged him to calm down and forget about it. She didn't want to talk about people who hated her so much. They would resort to violence. The girl just wants to live. Remembering those who like her and whom she likes, Instruct saved her and healed her, and Claire brought a delicious pudding and wished her a speedy recovery. Besides, Ordi and Aunt Rita were worried about her. And she also has Ezgian, who gets angry for her. Now the slime was completely bewildered, and the girl understood that her speech had moved him. Ezgian just grumbled that nothing could move him. Lenatis didn't argue and offered him pudding again. Biting a fairly decent piece and still chewing the slime, admitted that it was a very good dish created by humans. Lenatis was glad that her little round friend liked it, and now she herself was going to taste the sweetness. But then the girl remembered that she had forgotten to mention the most important name. Of the people who care about her, it was Theodore's name, but now Lenatis remained silent, and swallowing a piece of dessert she agreed that it was delicious a little later. The young lord called her and asked her to get ready. The girl nodded obediently, although she herself still didn't understand what she had to prepare for. Theodore reminded her that she still hadn't spent the money he gave her recently, and then he announced that they would go out today to spend it all. Lenatis was stunned. It was her reserve fund, what she was saving for the future. A few hours earlier, Instruct went to see the Duke and told him they should reinforce security around the annex. But Theodore reminded him that the right to dispatch soldiers belongs to Archduke Theodore. Glasses knows that, but as his personal knight, he wants to make a recommendation following protocol. The annex is part of the Archduchy, and there shouldn't be a lack of soldiers since anything could happen. The Duke didn't fully understand what he was referring to. The night with those unexpected events, then Instruct confessed that yesterday they found an intruder in the backyard, someone who entered without permission. Glasses was immediately informed about the intruder, and that intruder's name is Countess Pablo. Theodore was stunned that lady visited him the day before yesterday. Why would she be there yesterday? Then he remembered the events of the day before yesterday, when that bout of madness attacked him. Lenatis had to calm him down immediately. He even felt her touch again in that instant, but returning to reality. He asked what the Countess could have done yesterday in the annex. With a somewhat guilty voice, the knight reported that Lady Pablo went to discipline a rude maid. Remembering that no one other than Lenatis had met that lady, Theodore knew he was referring to his sorceress. In that very second, the Duke boiled with rage, and the knight hurried to calm him down, saying that he took the maid back and gave her first aid. Now Theodore was sure that Instruct had healed her wounds yesterday, and guilt washed over him again. Then he asked him to remind him of the name of that rude lady, and the knight said, Camilla de Pablo. The Duke's feelings were already roaring inside him. He promised himself that he would never forget that name. That morning, Lenatis felt much better, and her wounds had healed very well during the night. The girl attributed it to having eaten deliciously the night before. and also having rested wonderfully. Aunt Rita and Ordy allowed her to rest today as well, but she believed she should still do her job, and while carrying a tray with tea to the Duke's room, she noticed a worried instructor leaving from there. It was rare to see him like that. Surely something had happened to Theodore again. Although he seemed fine recently, Lenatis greeted the knight asking him about his visit to the Duke, and he admitted that they had already finished. Then he examined the girl's face and noticed that she was much better, although she still wore bandages then. She remembered that she hadn't thanked Glasses for his care because she was busy, and she did so now. But he told her she didn't need to thank him, that he was simply glad she was better, however, upon seeing the crown of her head, when Lenatis bowed. He noticed that her hair looked soft and fluffy. It reminded him of something. He even decided to touch it, which made the girl a little uncomfortable. She immediately asked why he was touching her head, but the knight just laughed cheerfully, and only advised her not to bother people that way. Next time, Lenatis stated that she was already trying her best, but as her father says, she easily irritates people. At that moment, the Duke observed them, and noticed that the two of them were getting along well right in front of his room. The girl immediately reported that she had brought him tea and prepared to reinforce security when Lenatis hid behind Duke Theodore. In his room, the knight remembered what her hair reminded him of. That pink mane reminded him a lot of the soft wool of a little sheep. The girl, in fact alone with the Duke, looked like a guilty little sheep in front of him, especially because at that moment, he looked at her with a slightly piercing gaze, as if he were going to scold her. Lenatis didn't understand what she had done wrong, and why the young master was looking at her like that. Because of this, she was experiencing different feelings one after another and didn't know where to put herself now. Suddenly, the Duke turned around, but only because her face reminded him of what had happened before. He doesn't understand why she came to serve him tea even though her wounds haven't fully healed yet. Theodore himself thought that this girl should have rested for longer. Turning back to her again, he suddenly said that Lenatis still hadn't left the estate. The girl confirmed it, and right at that moment, Theodore asked her to get ready. He wanted to take her for a walk so she could spend the remaining money she had saved in her piggy bank. It's those 2 million that the Duke gave her not long ago to buy a new dress. She saved it and didn't spend it to leave it for the future when she lives with her sister. But it seems that today Lenatis will have to spend that money by force at the boutique. The girl's eyes almost popped out when she saw that the clothes cost 4.5 million lunas. Now she understood why the Duke had given her 2 million, but she didn't even have anywhere to show off such luxurious dresses. Lenatis was totally confused. It seemed to her that Theodore was simply making fun of her. The Duke's thoughts were that Lenatis didn't want to leave him, that's why she didn't leave the estate. But fortunately, he had business in the commercial district, a perfect excuse to go for a walk with her. And now he was asking her to buy clothes in such an expensive store. This simply tormented the young woman, but so as not to fail her lord, she decided to buy something cheap and return quickly. Suddenly, a woman approached her from behind and started shouting at Lenatis, asking her what she was doing. The girl was completely perplexed. She was just looking at the dresses and hadn't done anything wrong. It turned out to be a saleswoman who was annoyed that the girl was hovering around the clothes as if planning to steal. She snatched the dress from her hands, claiming that everything was very expensive and that she couldn't afford it. Then she pointed to the door with her finger, and in a furious tone, demanded that she leave there immediately. But Lenatis pretended not to understand her completely, which infuriated the saleswoman even more. Imagine who then added that people like her were always loitering around the store and ruining its image when suddenly Lenatis, with a certain pride, declared that she just wanted to thank the woman. She could do nothing if her master ordered her to leave. What else could she do, poor Lenatis? That way she could return peacefully to her master, Theodoro, and keep her valuable money. Lenatis even felt the urge to hug the saleswoman, saying that those clothes were too expensive for her. And while the woman thought she was crazy, Duke Theodoro himself entered the store. What a twist! The ladies were astonished, instantly interrupting their argument upon seeing him appear. The saleswoman fell completely silent, captivated by his beauty, which denoted his noble lineage. His attire was of the highest quality, a clear indicator of his aristocratic origins. She immediately apologized profusely, believing she had disturbed him as he looked around the place. She then offered her services, urging him not to hesitate to ask for anything he needed. Amidst her stammering, the Duke couldn't get a word in. It seemed she didn't understand he was with the girl. Lenatis understood perfectly. Compared to Theodore, she looked like a mere commoner, but he approached the distressed Lenatis and demanded that the saleswoman explain what she had done to his companion. Both Lenatis and the saleswoman's mouths fell open in surprise. No one had expected that reaction from the Duke. They were trying to comprehend what was happening, but Theodore simply repeated his question, raising his voice even louder. But Lenatis noticed from his expression that he was beginning to get furious. Indeed, the Duke had a stony expression, and his gaze pierced through the saleswoman and the wall behind her. The woman bowed immediately, assuring him that she was unaware of who her visitors were. She simply hadn't expected that girl to be the companion of such an important gentleman, but Theodore only pointed out that she was bowing to the wrong person, and that she should apologize not to him. The saleswoman was no fool, and understood she had to apologize to that ragged girl. Grinding her teeth, she bowed before her and offered her deepest apologies. But the girl wasn't bothered, as she wasn't planning on buying anything anyway. When they were offered the VIP room, Lenatis began to refuse, sensing there would be even more expensive items there, and insisting that such measures were unnecessary. Suddenly the Duke, declared that he didn't want to buy anything there after seeing how they treated their customers. Then he turned to Lenatis, proposing they go to another store together. The young woman followed him meekly, casting a glance at the owner on her way out. And the owner was left there filled with sadness, realizing she had lost a very wealthy customer. Lenatis felt a strange but pleasant sensation, like when a male character helps the heroine of a novel. Instrid was waiting for them outside, and as soon as they arrived, Theodoro asked to be taken to another women's clothing store. Instrid recommended another one nearby, which was more expensive. Lenatis thought the two of them had planned this. She tried to convince the gentleman that it was already quite late, and suggested they return. But the gentleman reminded her that it was still daytime speaking, as if someone were forcing him to. The Duke understood Lenatis's displeasure over the incident, and promised to stay by her side. This, of course, did not please her, since then she would definitely have to spend money and buy a dress. It was a dead end, and she didn't want to tell her employer the truth. But she couldn't bear it, and declared that she needed the money. Teodoro and Instrid exchanged glances, and then stared at the pink-haired girl, questioningly. The Duke even asked what she meant, and she proceeded to thank him for his great concern, explaining that she understood the gentleman wished to compensate her for her torn clothes, but for her that was money she could use later. Besides, she had nowhere to wear an expensive dress. Upon hearing this explanation, the gentleman could barely contain his laughter, but Lenatis noticed and it infuriated her. But she continued explaining that the day would come when all this would be over, and the young master would finally return to normal. On that day, she wishes to leave the estate and continue living with the person she loves. At that moment, both men became very serious as they didn't know that Lenatis was referring to her sister. The gentleman, however, was interested in knowing who she loved, and the Duke felt disappointed. The three of them were lost in different thoughts, but just then, Teodoro decided it was time to return. This made the girl happy. Besides, she felt an extreme exhaustion, even though the day hadn't been particularly hectic. At that instant, the only thing the young woman desired was to return as soon as possible and collapse into her bed. Exhaustion overcame her. Her head drooped and she fell asleep. The Duke noticed her lack of energy. 1 minute later, she was sound asleep, which was surprising to Teodoro, considering her recent vitality. Seeing her head nod as she slept, he understood her discomfort. She needed a more comfortable position. And then her confession resurfaced in his mind. She wanted to be with the person she loved when all of this was over. Along with this, he understood that Lenatis was postponing her own happiness for that loved one. Teodoro remembered the day of his first attack. He felt devastated by his terrible fate. He could foresee his future a dreadful end awaited him. And worst of all, no one would shed a single tear for him. Although he didn't see the point in thinking about it, that was his destiny and he couldn't escape. Even his parents called him a monster. His life was a disaster, and nothing ever went his way. But today the clothes were just an excuse. It pained Theodore to see her hurt, and he wanted to make up for it. And in the end, the one doing him yet another favor turned out to be this young lady. His gaze fixed once more on her pink hair, which seemed magical to him. He felt the urge to touch it and did so at once, but very carefully so as not to wake Lenatis. In truth, he didn't want to cause her any harm, nor did he want her to suffer at the hands of others. And if he didn't have this affliction, she wouldn't be in the mansion, nor would she have been hit. Suddenly, in her sleep, Lenatis began to murmur that she couldn't eat anymore, that she was going to explode. The Duke was startled at first, but then he understood it all and felt curious about her dream. Then, drooling with a look of satisfaction, the girl began to murmur about pudding. Teodoro remembered his father speaking of that witch, merely as an instrument to cure his madness. That was why the young Duke had kissed her without hesitation, seeking her magic to nullify his own insanity. That's what he had thought until now when the carriage jolted and Teodoro almost fell on top of Lenatis. But she didn't even feel it and continued to snore peacefully, which pleased him quite a bit. Then, he gently tapped Instrad, who was riding with the coachman, and asked him to have the man drive more smoothly. The coachman reminded him that they had to reach their destination at a specific time. No excuses, but Teodoro saw no problem in being a little delayed, and again asked them not to rush. The Duke noticed that looking at the girl made him feel calmer. Although he'd never heard of a witch bringing hope, that's what he felt beside Lenatis, and it seemed to him that with her perhaps a happy ending awaited him. Teodoro remembered being a child hiding behind a tree and sobbing inconsolably. His father approached and asked him why he was crying, but the boy was afraid to answer. The man didn't insist on a response. He simply held out his hand, asking him to get up. Little Theodore was horrified to see that the hand was covered in blood. The father didn't understand why his son was so shocked, and stated that the boy had the same hands. Terrified, Theodore looked at his own limbs, and saw that they were in fact covered in blood up to his elbows. The father pretended to comfort him, saying the poor boy had simply inherited the cursed blood. However, he was the heir to the Duchy of Cario, and he is just like his father. Now the boy has no hope. He will never have a normal life again. His fate was already sealed because there is no escape from it. Theodore became more and more frightened. It seemed to him that the air around him was turning to blood, and it filled his lungs, forming sharp masses that tore at his flesh. The next instant he tried to scream and opened his eyes. There he saw a terrified Lenatis. He didn't immediately understand what was happening, or why the girl a blanket in her hands was so frightened. She explained that she had brought him tea, but he had been sleeping, and she only wanted to cover him with the blanket. Now Teodoro understood that all those horrible images he had just seen were only a nightmare. But the girl didn't let him finish his thought, lamenting that the weather was changing quickly, and she didn't want the master to catch a cold. Her sister always told her it was easy to get sick in this kind of weather, and the Duke understood that she was close to her sister. The girl immediately began to tell him how wonderful her little sister was, how she had taken care of her and raised her. She was now 22, but she had raised Lenatis since she was born, after their mother died. In truth, the girl didn't want to continue talking about Astel, nor did she want to talk about her father. But strangely, he showed interest in her sister, and she felt that this could trigger his madness. So she changed the subject. She became curious and asked if Teodoro was an only child, and he confessed that he had an older brother. Lenati was surprised then. She always thought he had a younger brother, although that was never mentioned in the novel. But now she doesn't understand why the heir is Teodoro, since normally the eldest are the ones who inherit, although perhaps that brother was such an idiot that they decided to remove him from that destiny. On the other hand, he could have left the mansion with some commoner. The novel mentioned nothing about it. To calm her curiosity, the girl began to ask carefully what had happened to that brother, and Teodoro admitted that he died 18 years ago from madness right before his eyes. Upon hearing that Lenati understood, she had touched upon a painful subject, and even felt a little ashamed of her questions. But for her it was also quite sudden information, and she understood that his brother couldn't find someone like her. Teodoro then declared that his brother had found the right sorceress. Lenati was bewildered. She didn't understand why he had died if he had a way to be cured. The Duke explained that in a fit of madness his brother couldn't control himself and killed the sorceress. And when that witch died, he became completely irrational, and his father had no choice but to shoot him. Hearing that, Lenati even stuttered. For an instant she felt a terrible fear, and Teodoro continued that with his own eyes he saw his brother kill someone, and then die himself. It was noticeable on the young Duke's face that those memories weighed on him. He even seemed to feel guilty. The young woman understood how horrible it was to see one family member kill another regardless of the relationship. The Duke noticed how Lenati tried to hide her trembling, but it was impossible after such a story. Now he himself feared that at some point, he might hurt this young woman due to his madness. He begged to change the subject, but Lenati suddenly lunged at him with a blanket and wrapped him up like a baby. This left Teodoro completely bewildered. Moreover, his mood had taken a radical turn, and then Lenati leaned over him, hugging him by the neck, which only increased his shock. The girl in a firm voice declared that the young master would never do something like that to her, referring to the murder, and assured him that everything would be all right, so he shouldn't worry so much about it. What's more, she trusts in her strength and won't die so easily. Her voice sounded proud, and Teodoro felt uncomfortable seeing her distant gaze. The girl explained about the blanket, that wrapping oneself up like that makes one feel more relieved. Then she let out a small laugh because in that state he reminded her of a kimbap. However, realizing she had acted too impulsively, Lenati immediately apologized. She in no case meant anything bad by it and hoped the Duke would be more comfortable like this. Teodoro felt himself warming up, but he believed it wasn't the blanket but Lenati. Later, ready for bed, she wondered if she had overstepped, although Teodoro said nothing. But she couldn't just stand by idly after hearing that story. 18 years ago, Teodoro was only 6, and he already carried a tragic past. Now Lenati understood her pity for him, and why she saw a lost child in him. Because that child still lives within Duke Teodoro. The girl understood his fear as a child, and what he fears now. He was terrified that he would have a similar attack and it would be his end. But she trusted in a good outcome. Then she imagined Estella killing someone in front of her. She would surely be scared out of her wits and wouldn't know what to do. And her sister would be there, her back turned with a bloody knife, forcing her to watch. But it turns out Estella was just making tomato soup, and those stains were tomato juice. Lenati changed her mind so easily because she only knew her sister as someone good, not a villainess. But then she decided to imagine Estella again holding a sword with astonishing coldness. With a glacial expression, she approaches her target, and what's more, she is terribly beautiful. Lenati once again couldn't imagine her as a murderer, but she thought she was going crazy for even thinking it. She even hit the pillow to clear her mind, but she only woke up the slime, who started to complain. The girl apologized instantly and asked what she could do, and he just asked her to be quiet. But he was referring to Teodoro because if he remains like a child, he will live a pitiful life. These thoughts saddened Lenati, and she wanted to prevent it at all costs. Squeam didn't understand why she worried so much. The master has a lot of money and an incredible quality of life. Understanding that the slime was completely right, the girl replied that happiness can't be bought with money. He just nodded sardonically, saying that it's impossible to buy it if you don't have enough money. In response to this, Lenati declared that she was very happy with her sister, even though they didn't have a single cent. The slime became curious if she would have been happier if they had also had money. He hit the nail on the head again, and Lenati couldn't deny it. Then Squeam decided to show some compassion, and had a brilliant idea. The woman could help the man feel better. A perfect solution. The girl was surprised again, not understanding how the slime knew so much about people and about that. She got nervous and started to squeeze the pink blob, but she felt herself starting to blush. Squeam realized the girl had misunderstood him and clarified that he meant a massage and called her a pervert. A massage always improves one's mood. And if the Duke feels better, Lenati won't have to worry. Suddenly she understood. The idea was brilliant. She even hugged the slime as if she were going to kiss it. Squeam grumbled for her to let go. But when Lenati called him a genius, he liked it a little. The girl understood that he needed the opposite of a tragedy. The heroes had to be happy in the end. Now she had to change the novel's tragic genre to a healing one, but she didn't know how to achieve it, even though she had read tons of romance novels. She never found anything remotely healing. There was everything from emperors to ministers and merchants, and even presidents and secretaries. There were even beastmen and demons. But in the end, they all turned out to be fanatics. Obsessed. But now she was glad that no one saw the trash bin where she had sent entire digital libraries. Then she died. And suddenly she realized she didn't remember how. Although she remembered all the books, her memories were blurry. She didn't know if it was an accident or if it hurt. She was distracted from these thoughts only by the cry of Squeam, which scared her very much. It turns out she had gotten lost in thought and had let go of him, and he was grumbling because she was mistreating him. Lenati started to apologize, but it wasn't working, and she started squeezing him again, although more gently this time while giving him a sort of massage. The girl noticed the slime was almost purring with pleasure. At that moment she realized that the her from her past life was different from who she is now. In that world her life had ended and now she is here, and moreover she is very important. Therefore for her own sake Lenati must change the genre of this world to healing. But her thoughts returned to the fact that she doesn't know what to do to achieve it, and the hysteria returned. The slime, who was just enjoying himself, didn't understand why this person was returning to despair. Then the girl asked him what would help him feel better and happier. For Squeam, the answer was always the same. He dreamed of the world bowing before him. That's how he would be happy. But Lenati asked him to say something else. Something that from a human point of view could bring happiness. One option was something tasty, and that made Lenati happy. But Teodoro already eats better than she does. Then the slime thought of something else, but hesitated a little with the answer. And in the end, he confessed that he liked sleeping next to Lenati because she has a special scent. Next to her, it's pleasant and cozy. And he even has wonderful dreams when they sleep together. These words made the girl so happy that she even hugged the slime and admitted that she didn't feel so lonely with him. Suddenly, the tone of her voice changed a bit, and she suggested going to sleep. And Squeam was just starting to enjoy it when Lenati put him on her head, but he kept slipping. Although one couldn't expect anything else from a slime. Then her mind wandered to delicious food and a good rest to recover her energy. The next day, Claire became worried about Lenati upon noticing her overly pensive face. She thought something serious had happened, but she just smiled and admitted her head was full of ideas since the day Claire advised her to keep her head down. They became close friends, which is why Lenati decided to start her healing with her assuring her friend that everything was fine. Besides that morning, when she woke up, a rather appetizing breakfast was waiting for her. The girls chatted animatedly about the little things in life while eating scones with tea. Suddenly they heard behind them the conversation of some men talking about a light flirtation during a trip. Lenati turned around immediately to see who had come up with that crazy idea. In front of her was Noah, a tall and quite muscular blonde man who understood that she had overheard their conversation. The men apologized to the girls, realizing they were talking too loudly. Noah, with sarcasm, said he didn't know there would be someone with curly hair so busy eating here every day. Lenati, she understood they were talking about her hair and declared that it curled on its own. The man became curious to know what she did upon waking up, a question the girl found insolent, while Lenatis was thinking of a response. He asked Claire the same thing, banging his fist on the table. She answered that she chopped vegetables, and the blonde man added that everyone gets up and works, and he doesn't understand why Rita is so benevolent with Lenatis. Even Ordi ignores that she only rests. His shout didn't scare her. After dealing with her father, it was easy to adapt to anything, and in reality, she has a dangerous job. Not just anyone accepts having their blood sucked and risking their life. The blonde man blurted out that everyone thinks Lenatis is a witch, and that they should never have hired her. Because of her, everyone now has more work and suffers for it. The girl didn't understand what was wrong with this guy. It seemed like no girl wanted him. Still, she thought those insults were unfair, and was starting to lose her patience. Then she turned suddenly and asked Claire where the axe was. Claire froze, and the blonde man fell silent instantly. They thought Lenatis was going to cut something off that rude man. With a terrified look, the maiden with pigtails begged her friend not to resort to violence. In the end, they went out to the courtyard, and of course the other kitchen servants followed them to watch some chickens. They were walking around the courtyard, and upon seeing the crowd, looked at the axe with suspicion. Lenatis was standing in front of the blonde man, breathing on his navel. But the tension between them was growing. Claire still didn't understand what her friend was going to do, and explained that the axe was only for chopping firewood. But with a resolute and arrogant tone, Lenatis addressed the blonde man and pointed her finger at him, then declared that although it was no trouble for her to chop firewood every morning, she was going to prove that he wasn't worth the money he received. The man just laughed, since the mansion needed a lot of firewood, and a girl like Lenatis couldn't handle such a quantity. Besides, he thought she would later complain to Orty, saying they forced her to chop firewood and he wouldn't tolerate that. But the girl was more than sure of herself and decided to challenge that conceited man if in 1 minute she chopped more firewood than him. He would never criticize her work again, and if she lost, the girl agreed to give him 20% of her salary. Claire thought it was too bold a bet, but her friend asked her not to doubt her, and the guy who was greedy for money accepted. He even promised that if she won, no one else would bother her. At the same time, he gloated that even if she lost and begged and cried, he would take her salary anyway. His personal best is 12 logs per minute, and he wasn't going to lose to a brat like her. He laughed because he thought she couldn't even lift the axe, let alone chop firewood. But neither he nor Claire knew that Lenatis was the strongest girl in the entire village, and now they could only marvel at the skill with which she split the logs with the axe. Meanwhile, Lord Theodore was again lost in deep thought. This even worried his assistant a little, but he assured him that everything was fine. Still, Orty noticed that something was wrong, as the Duke had been sitting in front of a book for a long time without turning the page. Suddenly, Theodore asked his assistant if he knew what a happy kimbap was. He was perplexed. He had never heard of such a thing, and the Duke asked him not to worry about it. Lenatis had called him that recently, and he decided to ask her directly. He is simply curious to know what it is. Now he even looked forward to tea time. Suddenly, a great interest arose in him. What does his sorceress do when she isn't serving him tea? Meanwhile, Lenatis had completely crushed the wicked and persistent guy, and proudly watched his despair. The other servants cheered happily in her honor, although before no one had believed she would succeed. They still couldn't believe it, as she had split 28 logs in 1 minute, while the blonde Noah had barely managed 10. Some suspected she was a witch, while others thought the girl was naturally that strong. Meanwhile, she, holding a log, demanded that the insolent man fulfill his promise. The man who just a moment ago had been haughty now didn't understand where she got so much strength from, the fragile-looking young woman. In any case, she had won the bet, and it was time for everyone to return to their duties. Lenatis was only infuriated that because of that annoying guy, she couldn't even have a proper breakfast. To express her mood, she crumbled a piece of firewood, which unsettled Noah even more. The others whispered while Claire suggested checking the pantry to grab a bite. People were becoming convinced that Lenatis was human, not a witch, and was hungry after working. On the way, Lenatis began to complain. She was craving kimchi fried rice. Perhaps because of her voracious hunger, she craved food from her past life, tteokbokki and bulgogi, and also kimchi stew. But Claire didn't know what kimchi was. Lenatis explained that it was the only thing that could make her happy at that moment. And then she had a brilliant idea. The Duke ate well, but she could give him something new. That would surely make him happy. So she decided to ask her friend for help. They headed to the kitchen immediately, although Claire didn't understand why there and not the dining room. A while later, Lenatis brought the Duke a dish covered with a huge round lid. He thought it was time for tea, but found it strange that it was served this way. Lenatis explained that it was an appetizer, almost a meal, but that the tea was also ready. Theodore was a little surprised, and the girl proudly declared that she had prepared it herself. Then, she lifted the lid with a flourish and wished the Duke to enjoy his meal. Theodore, upon seeing what was on the plate, was visibly perplexed. It was something unusual. A few hours earlier, Lenatis and Claire had gone to the kitchen to prepare Korean food. For Theodore, suddenly the girl realized that in this world kimchi didn't exist, the kind her mother and grandmother used to make. For bulgogi, a special store-bought sauce is needed, and Lenatis doesn't know how to make it. That left tteokbokki, which needs chili sauce, and the exact same problem arose. Lenatis didn't understand how one could live in a place where you couldn't prepare a single one of those dishes. The necessary ingredients weren't available here. But then she remembered she could make chicken. Not all the ingredients for that dish were available either, but it could be prepared fried, which is also delicious. Claire rejoiced with her friend, imagining how delicious this dish would be, but she immediately remembered that Lord Theodore doesn't like fried food, so they rarely prepare it. Lenatis found this strange, as it's very tasty. She had even tried fried cod recently. Moreover, it turned out that to prepare that dish, one had to request permission from the chef. The next option was spiced chicken. For that, everything should have been available, but her enthusiasm vanished instantly when she realized there was no hot sauce, although instead of sauce, she could add paprika powder and a little sugar for a sweet touch. And if you add fried squid, you get the famous Lenatis stew. That is precisely what the girl served to Lord Theodore, who didn't understand what it was. Lenatis explained that it was a special dish from her region, but the Duke didn't understand why. The girl also wanted to prepare rapaquié, but she doesn't know how to make rice cakes or noodles. Still, she was sure he would love this dish, and the Duke would ask her to be his personal cook. Theodore, with some suspicion, decided to trust the girl and picked up some vermicelli on his fork, bringing it to his mouth. When he chewed a bit, he immediately coughed and declared that it was completely inedible. Lenatis's dream of becoming the personal chef to Theodore himself was instantly shattered. He was supposed to be delighted with the flavor and beg her to cook for him forever. For the Duke, it was too spicy and too sweet, probably because of the pepper and sugar. Besides, it seemed to him that the taste was subtly like honey and had a fishy aroma at the same time. It was beyond strange. Lenatis couldn't believe the young master hadn't liked her culinary creation. And she had tried so hard. Now she was afraid the Duke would think she wanted to poison him, but Theodore just calmly asked for tea, and Lenatis attended to him immediately. Back in her room after taking that dish, the girl decided to try for herself what she had prepared. But it turned out that the taste was truly horrible, just as the young master had said. The girl didn't understand what was wrong since she had put so many delicious things in it. Now it made even her grimace, the taste of that incomprehensible thing she had created. Although on second thought it was always Astel who cooked, and Lenatis only supervised the process. Even in her past life, she had never cooked herself. Her mother or grandmother did everything. Her mother was a kind and wonderful person. She worked as a kindergarten teacher. She had dark eyebrows and double eyelids with a dimple on one cheek, and her sweet smile sometimes looked a bit sinister. Now Lenatis only has memories left, and no longer feels connected to her past life. But the memories of her mother comfort her. It would be great if she could also remember her mother from this world. According to Estella, she is good, kind, and very beautiful, and she looked like an angel when she was nursing Lenatis. The girl remembered none of this, and she felt terribly bad about it. On the other hand, she still has Estella, so not all is lost. And life is beautiful, isn't it? Besides, now she must worry about Theodore's happiness, and since the stew was a failure, Lenatis decided to try something else. All that was left was to figure out what to do with this stew that even dogs would hesitate to eat, and Theodore still felt that horrible taste on his tongue that he would never dare to try again. He realized she had served him the stew without even tasting it herself, and he felt so awkward that he didn't even ask about the kimbap. This girl seemed increasingly strange to him. She served him the food with such pride and expected him to appreciate the taste. It was even noticeable that Lenatis was trembling while waiting for Theodore. He even found it endearing. He was curious to know if she had gone to sleep, or if she was plotting something again. Suddenly he was surprised to find himself thinking he wanted to see her, but a sinister voice behind him, like a ghost from the past, reminded him that he was a monster and she was a witch. Theodore felt the cold fingers of his horror, touching his neck as the voice asked him what he intended to do with that girl. When he gets bored, he won't be able to help it, and all his desire will end in bloodshed. The words his father had spoken that he would not escape that fate made the Duke slam his fist against the glass. In that moment, all sorts of feelings mixed within him at once. He felt his hands begin to tremble again. He wouldn't dare do anything to the girl who was still pondering over her dish. Lenatis grew very frustrated because she couldn't prepare something healing with delicious food, but suddenly she remembered something from her past life, and even exclaimed, scaring the slime, "There is something healing in agriculture, and it's a very special vegetable." The next morning, Lenatis dragged Claire to dig in the vegetable gardens to get the ingredient. In one go, they unearthed a great many sweet potatoes, and didn't even get dirty or scratched. Lenatis had never been interested in that, but she had seen many covers featuring healing farm products. Besides, Claire was in charge of the garden, so Lenatis easily found work there. She didn't love farming, but back in the village she used to do very heavy labor. That's why she feels pride and satisfaction harvesting in such a clean field. Lenatis loved it. It had been a long time since she had worked so comfortably with the sunlight and the breeze caressing her hair. Working is a pleasure, even if she sweats and smells. She even thought that dedicating herself to the farm was a way to heal. But it's just her personal therapy. In those moments, all worries disappear and she enjoys herself. Lenatis truly looked happy, but Claire didn't understand how this would cure the Duke. Lenatis's face once again showed signs of hysteria, which visibly frightened her friend. Theodore is a nobleman, and would never do something like this. He only walks gracefully through the garden, and observes what will surely be prepared for his table. That man has never even gotten his hands dusty. It's ridiculous to ask him to work on the farm. He'd sooner tear your head off. Claire noticed that her friend's spirits had plummeted, and became very worried about her, and she was on the verge of tears, not knowing what to do, when by pure chance, the knight Instrid noticed her. He saw her working hard in the garden, and thought she was feeling unwell from the suffocating heat, so he took her back to her room and asked why she wasn't resting. Lenatis felt a sense of déjà vu. Orty also used to tell her she never left the mansion, and the knight repeated, insisting that rest is vital, and that all workers have shifts. The girl was exhausted. Instrid even suggested she take a day off, and that nothing would happen if she went for a walk outside the mansion. Theodore is sleeping peacefully these days. There's nothing to worry about. Lenatis was surprised. She thought nightmares were tormenting him, and now she didn't understand why she was trying so hard to cure him, even though her body can recover in 2 hours. She's not like those heroines who wake up radiant and in a good mood. The knight encouraged her, saying that work is good but rest is essential, and then he left her room. Lenatis tried to understand for a good while why Instrid had visited her just for that, especially since her first impression of him had been quite negative, but now she saw that he was thoughtful. Although as he left her room he almost collided with Claire. The girl was startled more by the surprise, but the knight was intrigued by her shriek. Lenatis heard their conversation from her room, and now she understood he wasn't so thoughtful after all. The girl felt sorry for her friend, who with a trembling voice was apologizing to the knight. Lenatis couldn't just stand by and went out to clear up the situation immediately, but what she witnessed shocked her in an incredible way. Instrid wasn't going to scold the maid. On the contrary, he gently touched her head, then asked her to be more careful, and left without looking back. Suddenly, the avid reader of romance novels from her past life awakened within Lenatis, although to Claire the gesture seemed like a warning that next time he would rip her head off. Lenatis tried to calm her down, explaining that the knight had only patted her to encourage her, but she wouldn't calm down, thinking he would break her arm even though she had done nothing wrong. And as she trembled amidst horrible visions, Lenatis asked her what she wanted. This distracted Claire, and with a rather cheerful voice, she confessed that she had a request for her friend. Claire's request was simple. She needed help lighting the fire in the fireplace. However, the fire wouldn't light properly, and this greatly annoyed Lenatis, especially because the fireplace had to be lit in Theodore's room. Claire asked to take turns. Now it was Lenatis's turn, and she thought she would succeed, before the young master returned to his room. Soon the fire will be perfect for some roasted sweet potatoes, but now is not the time. She muttered her desire to secretly prepare and eat them aloud when she heard the Duke's voice asking about what she had been eating. It's impossible to describe the fright Lenatis got in that instant. It seemed as if her soul had done a lap around the mansion and returned. And Theodore, with complete calm, pointed out to her that lighting the fireplace wasn't exactly part of her job. He then asked who had asked her to do that. After all, she had very different responsibilities. But that question left the girl stunned. She didn't understand what the Duke really meant by that.